It's my pleasure to introduce again the Reverend Dr. Todd Bolsinger. I came to know of Todd through his book, Canoeing the Mountains and Tempered Resilience, but he does a whole lot more than only being an author. I say only with just a little bit of temperance there, but he's also the co-owner and principal of A.E. Sloan Leadership, Inc., which is a coaching and consulting firm. And he's also the executive director of the Dupree Center Church Leadership Institute, and is an associate professor of leadership formation at Fuller Theological Seminary. There's a whole lot more that I could share with you about him, but in your packet, you will find all the details of his current and former ministry. And we are pleased to welcome you, Todd, and to, again, we had an opportunity yesterday to share in his wisdom, and we look forward to today. There, just a little before we get started, people are asking about the slide decks. We are also recording these presentations, and they will be on our website next week sometime. So thank you, Todd, for being with us, and we look forward to your plenary with us today. We need you to unmute.
Thank you. It's really nice to be with you today. I decided that I need to start talking on mute at least once a day. It's just kind of like a spiritual practice for the pandemic, isn't it? I'm going to share my a slide deck, and I'll make it available for you to get all these slides, and it kind of said the greatest hits, including some stuff from yesterday, even if you missed it. So it'll be available. I'm going to pick up on this theme that we just talked about in terms of sabotage and how we can work our way through sabotage and how important that is. But let me start in a little bit different place. You'll see where this comes together quickly, I think. If you're at all familiar with a poet named David Whyte, David Whyte writes really, really interesting reflections on life. He's a great poet, but his life went through an interesting journey where he started actually working in corporate America. And while he was, his avocation was poetry, he was working a real job, if you will. And then he ended up leading a nonprofit, thinking that would be more fulfilling to him. But he really, really wanted to just be a poet. He wanted to write poetry and speak and teach. And he found himself in kind of a vocational crisis. And he tells in one of his books of spending a weekend in like a private retreat with Brother David Steindl-Rast. So here is Poet David and Brother David, and they're both together in a cabin. And Poet David looks at Brother David and says, "Brother David, tell me about exhaustion." Brother David pauses for a moment. He said he made it feel as if it's almost like he was in a confessional, if you will, in a Catholic church. And Brother David responds, "You know that the antidote to exhaustion is not necessarily rest." What is it then? The antidote to exhaustion is wholeheartedness. He said, "You are so tired through and through because you're only half here, and half here will kill you after a while. You need something to which you can give your full powers. You must do something heartfelt, and you must do it soon." I want to say as I begin that I'm a big fan of rest. I think rest is really important. I think I'm always thinking that I need more sleep. I work really hard at trying to keep Sabbath. I take vacations. I use every vacation day I have, and I love to play outside. I am a big fan of rest. I am thrilled that I know so many people right now who are on sabbatical, that after this years of this pandemic, it seemed like finally many colleagues, clients of mine that I consult, friends and colleagues are able to be on sabbatical. I think rest is really important. But what I want to talk about today is not rest, but the way in which we work. I think there needs to be a rethinking of the way in which we work, because some of the ways in which we work and the things that we are facing make us, after a while, half here. We want to be faithful to the call we have, but we don't even recognize the degree to which we end up being half-hearted. Now, let me say something really important right off the bat. If anything you hear me say in the next several minutes together sounds like I'm saying, "Oh, just suck it up, Buttercup. You can do better. Come on." You're missing the point. That's actually not what I'm saying. I'm not talking about trying harder. I'm talking about leading differently, and leading differently in the midst of the reality of what most clergy tell me and others who do this kind of work that I do is the most soul-sucking, difficult part of ministry. So for me, you have to understand that I believe every minister is a leader. That we are always, whether you are a clergy or a lay person, whether you are ordained in any fashion, whether you are, if you step into a function, it's not even about a title, it's about a function. If you step into this task, energizing a community of people toward their own transformation to accomplish a shared mission, then you are leading. What you are doing requires that people are changed in order to accomplish the thing that God's given you to do, then you are leading. And that for most of us, the struggle of leadership is not the challenge out there in the world, the changing environment, COVID, the pandemic, the secularism, a divided political world, whatever it would be. The challenge that most of us experience most profoundly is the internal challenges of our own people. If you're familiar with Ed Friedman, and I know many of you really are from his work of Generation to Generations and A Failure of Nerve, he was asked, this is back in the 1980s, he was asked what it was that made people get discouraged and give up, what it was that made leaders burn out. And again, he doesn't talk about rest, even though he would. He talks about what happens in the work. He says they had become so focused on the aches and pains in the system that they had been thrown off course by the complaints. They had stopped supplying vision or had burned out fighting the resistance. They had ceased to be the strength in the system. In short, they had forgotten to lead. What was it that caused this to happen? I spend my life working on what's called adaptive change. And for the group that was with us yesterday, we went into some depth about what adaptive change requires of us. And that adaptive change starts when people have to let go of the past in order to move forward. When they are like a group of canoers who are trying to find a water route, who confront the Rocky Mountains and have to drop the canoes to keep going. And that we really found is that people don't resist change, they resist loss. And people resist loss so deeply, again, it's unfamiliar, that they will end up sabotaging you. So where I want to focus on today is on this fourth bullet on this slide. You cannot go alone, but you haven't succeeded until you survive the sabotage. What I want to talk about is how we survive sabotage. Ed Friedman called it the most important aspect of leadership. The capacity of a leader to be prepared for, to be aware of, to learn how to skillfully deal with sabotage may be the most important aspect of leadership. It's literally the key to the kingdom, he said. He says, if you're a leader, you should expect sabotage. That what happened to Moses is going to happen to you. And that happens over and over and over again. Let's look at the way he describes sabotage. This is really important to understand this. He says, the important thing to remember about the phenomenon of sabotage is that it is part and parcel of it is a systemic part of leadership. The important thing to remember about the phenomena of sabotage is that it is a systemic part of leadership. It is part and parcel of the leadership process. Another way of putting this is that a leader can never assume success because he or she has brought about a change. It's only after having first brought about a change, then subsequently endured the resultant sabotage, that the leader can feel truly successful. Now, let me say a bit more about this. When I get to speak to lots of different church groups, lots of different backgrounds, lots of different denominations, and I always explain to them that we Presbyterians have a very particular part of our theology, that we basically believe this, that if God is inspiring a change, then the way it works is this. There's a group of people who get together and who think about and study and plan that change. We'll call that a committee. And that committee will then work together until they will come up with a decision that they think is really important that would bring the change. We'll call that a motion. And they will bring that motion to a larger body, say a session or a presbytery or a general assembly. And that larger body that has authority to make the change will then have a properly called conversation with proper order to do so and decorum to do so, like Robert's Rules of Order. And then there will be a properly called vote. And if there is a properly called vote on a properly thought through motion, and you get one vote more than the majority, you get Pentecost. The Holy Spirit falls upon you at that moment. You brought change. Hallelujah. This is renewal. We did it. And because this, we are really, really good at coming up with ideas that will get us the right amount of votes so we can bring change. All this is good. Except what Friedman would say is this: right after you get the votes is when the sabotage begins. You have to make the change, then endure the sabotage. The group of people who said, yes, I know we voted for that, but that's fine, but we're still going to do it this way. Or yes, I know we said this, but it takes a while for changes to actually come. What happens is you make a change, then you have to survive the resultant sabotage. And if you do, then you've been successful as a leader. Because this is how sabotage works. Sabotage is normal. It's natural. It's to be expected. You heard me say this earlier. Sabotage is not the bad things that evil people do, but the human things that anxious people do. And because it is so normal and natural, we experience it over and over again and don't even realize the degree to which it is beginning to take a toll on us. So when we study the story of Moses, as we just did, and we experience that it's normal and natural for the Israelites who have just witnessed the biggest miracle that any people would ever. 650,000 of them saw the Red Sea parted and saw the Egyptian army destroyed, not just sent back, right? God could have just closed up the water and sent them back. He destroyed their army. This is not only freedom, but this is freedom from tyranny also. This is ultimate power of God. They experienced that, and within 6 weeks, they want to go back. Sabotage. It's normal. It's natural. It's not the bad things that evil people do. It's the human things that anxious people do. Now, what's interesting about this story, however, is that the people are grumbling there in Exodus, and Moses doesn't take the bait. He doesn't collude with them. He doesn't go back. He tells them, see what God has done and watch how God will continue to be with you. And so let's go forward. And so he calls upon the Lord, and the Lord provides manna, and they move forward. But when you get to Numbers 11, the people are grumbling again. And this time they're grumbling, not because they're hungry, but because they're bored with the miracle that God is doing every morning. They're tired of the manna. Oh my gosh, manna again. I mean, I'm so glad that God provides our needs, but wouldn't you rather have the flesh pots? Remember the flesh pots? Remember the leeks and onions? Oh my gosh, we could go back. This time, Moses gets mad. He goes to God. God gets mad. Moses is mad. God is mad. Moses turns to God and says, if you're going to leave me with these people, you could kill me now. I don't know if you ever came home from a Sunday morning service and said that to your spouse. If God's going to leave me here, he could kill me now. But I'll bet you at least once you thought to yourself, I could sell real estate. I could sell life insurance. I could teach biology. Oh my gosh, if I could do anything else but this, I would do it. According to recent polls, about 40% of all clergy thought that last year, and 50% of all those under 45. If I could do anything else, I would do it. So we're half-hearted. One of the things we learn is that whenever we get resistance, we are tempted toward what Ed Friedman calls a failure of nerve. A failure of nerve is when you collude with the anxiety of your people to keep the status quo. You collude for non-change. A failure of nerve is what happens when you are clear that you have to change. And if you don't change, you're in trouble. But you find a reason because people are so upset or anxious or will be sad or fearful to not change. I worked with one of our sister congregations, a Presbyterian church. I worked with the pastor. The pastor said, I was brought here because we are in a neighborhood that has a growing demographic. There are growing numbers of young families. We have a big property and we have great facilities and we have all the possibility for growing. We have an older congregation and I was brought here to be the pastor who would lead them forward to reach the new young families who are all moving into this town. And yet we refuse to make any changes. The pastor looked at me and said, I have told them, I sat down and figured out, based upon the amount of money we're losing, the amount of members we're losing, that if we don't make a change, I told them the day that we would turn the lights out in the church. I told them we must change or we will die. And they immediately, as the session, prayerfully decided that we're going to undertake some changes. And then in the parking lot, isn't it always in the parking lot? Several of them came up to me and said, we know you need to make changes, but we were just talking amongst ourselves and wondering, could we put off some of these changes at least until the people here are no longer here? Basically, he had to explain to them that the church would die before they would, that they had done a better job of taking care of their physical bodies than they had the body of Christ, and that they needed to change. He had to hold them to the thing that they've said. But what happens to so many pastors and so many of us at this moment is we have a failure of nerve. We say, okay, we get it. We'll slow the process down. We'll stop the changes. We need to take care of those who've been here. We get it. We got to take care of our saints. I get it. We need to make sure that people don't lose their church. I get it. And what we lose at this moment is the opportunity for the actual transformation that we might need. When we collude with the non-change, it is a failure of nerve. What I've also discovered in leaders that I work with is that some don't have a failure of nerve. They're able to stay clear. They're calm. They still work with these people. They love them deeply. They try not to shame them. They want to inspire them. They'll work with them and they'll keep doing it. But after a while, they have what's called a failure, what I call a failure of heart. That's what happened to Moses, just months and months in to listening to them grumble about the manna over and over again. It's when your own discouragement leads you to become cynical and disconnected from your people, to abandon the charge that you've been given. My friend Jimmy Miato is the president of Compassion International, and he says, the great danger of doing the work of God is it can undo God's work in you. I would say one of the things about seminary is that everybody who shows up at seminary today has already been working in a church, more than likely. They were people in a church. Somebody said to them, you're so good at this. You should go pro. You should go off to professional Christian school. And so they come to the seminary with church experience, and very often they show up with what I call post-traumatic church disorder. They've been traumatized by church. They're mad at the church. They're cynical of the church. They're last hope for the church. They have a failure of heart. What we've learned is that sabotage is often the cause for both a change leader's failure of nerve and failure of heart. So what do? What we need in the face of resistance is resilience. And how do we find resilience? Now, there's lots and lots of definitions on resilience, really good ones, and lots of good books out there. You can find a lot. This is my favorite. It's from a guy named Andrew Zolli. Andrew Zolli worked with nations that needed to be resilient, like they needed to come back from things like genocide in Rwanda. And this is his definition. Resilience is the capacity to maintain core purpose and integrity in the face of dramatically changed circumstance. Maintain core purpose and integrity in the face of dramatically changed circumstances. So now, if you know me at all, and if you spend more than 5 minutes with me, you're going to know that maintain is not a verb that gets me out of bed in the morning. I'm not a person deeply committed to maintaining anything, but maintaining core purpose, maintaining integrity. This is huge. You see, change shouldn't mean compromising our core purpose or compromising our integrity. Resilience is about holding on to that core purpose and holding on to that sense of integrity, even in the face of dramatically changed circumstances that have caused us to now be tempted toward a failure of nerve or a failure of heart. So how do we find resilience? Let me take you back in history, just to a pretty important date. August 28th, 1963. 250,000 people gathered in front of the Lincoln Memorial. They had come, most of them on church buses, many of them in their Sunday best, a lot of them from the front lines of the civil rights movement. They had come in from the protests and the marches and the lunch counters and the dogs and the hoses and the jails. They gathered there in Washington, D.C. for what was called a March for Jobs and Freedom. It was basically built around one idea, which basically was this: the United States of America has offered its citizens in the Declaration of Independence a promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, a promise that was extended to its African-American enslaved citizens in the Emancipation Proclamation. And now 100 years after that promise had been extended to its African-American citizens, it still was not realized. One speaker after another hit this theme. Mahalia Jackson, the gospel singer, sang 2 songs. Roger Mudd of CBS said, all the speeches in all the world couldn't have done what those 2 songs just did for these people here. And then the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was introduced as the moral leader of our nation and stood up and gave a presentation that he had been working on until 4 a.m. with his speechwriter friend, Clarence B. Jones. They had decided to bring home that theme that the United States of America had not made good on its promises. They did it by using an illustration of a promissory note. They said in the Emancipation Proclamation, our African-American brothers and sisters were given a check, a promissory note. And that check has been returned insufficient funds. And it is time for the United States of America to keep its word and make good on those promises. It's time to pay up. And then Dr. King had, in this just fleeting moment, the kind of experience probably you and I have had way more times than we would want to admit. The line didn't work. He had this amazing line and it landed, and it didn't land with a big amen or applause. It landed with kind of a thud, kind of like if you tell a joke and no one laughs, or you tell a story and people don't get the point. And he paused for just a second and he began to go off script. And behind him, he heard Mahalia Jackson yell at him, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream." And immediately he pivoted to a portion that he had developed for Detroit, to a section that he had spoken on before, that Mahalia Jackson had heard. And he launches into Isaiah chapter 40. Clarence B. Jones, who's sitting behind him, turns to the person next to him and says, "These people don't realize it, but they're about to go to church." And he says, "I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low. The rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together." This is our hope. This is the faith that I go back to the South with. What does Dr. King say at this moment? He says to these people who have come from the protests and the marches and the lunch counters and the dogs and the hoses and the jail, because I believe that a day is coming when God is going to redeem this world down to the dirt. We go back to work. We go back to the protests and the marches and the lunch counters and the dogs and the hoses and the jails. This is our hope. This is the faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we'll be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we'll be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. I don't know about you, but when I read this, 2 things occur to me. One is this is a masterclass in preaching. Oh my gosh, this is parallelism. He takes 2 ideas that are discordant and he pulls them together. We will hew, we will transform. What do you do when you're facing a mountain of despair? You're facing so much resistance, it feels like a granite mountain of despair. What do you do if you're facing, like our African-American brothers and sisters, a 400-year-old mountain of despair? You don't blow it up with dynamite. You don't bash it with a sledgehammer, and you don't back down. You hew it. You transform it. You transform those jangling discords into a symphony. You hew out of that mountain of despair stones of hope. The second thing about this is I cannot hear this passage without having 1 Peter reverberating in my ears. Come to him, a living stone, and let yourself as living stones be built into a dwelling place for God. The glory of the Lord will be revealed. That God's presence will be here. What Dr. King literally is saying is that if we can find a way to transform this resistance into hope, God's presence will be seen. God's presence will be seen right here in the middle of the place of the greatest resistance because of the work that we are doing to transform that resistance, that mountain of despair, into stones of hope. So how do we become a tool that can hew? Tools that hew are really interesting. They're not sledgehammers. They don't bash through. They're like chisels that cut through, carve, shape, turn something that is inert and stubborn into something useful that you can build something from. How do we become a tool that can hew? I won't be able to tell you everything today, but I want to give you a couple of clues to think about in your own presbytery and in your own community as you go forward. The kinds of things that enable you to become a tool that can hew. And the first thing we discover is that this idea of finding resilience is wrong-headed. We don't find resilience. Resilience is not found, it's formed. It's a formation process, and it is a formation process that happens right in the crucible of leadership. It's formed in the middle of the struggle. Resilience is formed in the crucible of leadership. I call this tempered resilience, like a tempered tool that is both strong and flexible, that has the ability to cut through resistance and shape it. The tempered resilience is a grounded identity and a resilient character that is shaped through reflection, relationships, and a rule of life in a rhythm of leading and not leading. Reflection, relationships, and a rule of life in a rhythm of leading and not leading. Let me just spend a few minutes with you on the first couple of these, just so that we can start thinking about how to create the kind of presbytery, the kind of community that can cultivate tempered resilience. And then I'll let you explore the rest on your own. Let's start with this. I took a blacksmithing class so that I could learn something about this. There's a blacksmithing community in Los Angeles where I live. It's in a neighborhood. They have not had a horse there in 100 years, but they got blacksmiths. And you can go and sign up and take a blacksmithing class. This was a picture from the class. This is my anvil. It has my name on it. This is where I did my work. And I just signed up. I have no history, no experience of blacksmithing. I don't hang out with blacksmiths. I don't know anything about this. I'm not even very good with tools, right? But I took this class. I show up at the class. I'm wearing jeans and a t-shirt. You go into the room. The first thing they do is they make you sign your name on a clipboard that basically says that you understand that everything in this shop can kill you. And that if it doesn't kill you, it can take a finger or a toe or an eyeball. In other words, this is a place where serious work is done. Then they hand you your protection. They give you earplugs. That's it, earplugs. I'm thinking I'm going to get chain mail, leather gloves, a helmet, something. No. Earplugs. And so wearing nothing but a pair of jeans, t-shirt, and earplugs, they hand me a pair of tongs, they hand me a piece of steel, and they tell me to put the steel into the fire, into the forge, and before I know what I'm doing, I'm blacksmithing. I haven't even had a full safety lecture yet, and I'm already in the middle of the process. And this is exactly like leading. Leaders are formed in the leading. We form resilience when we're facing the mountain of despair. We can't prepare for this ahead of time in the way that we would like to. Just remember this. The moment you become a leader, and I'm not even talking your title, I'm just talking like you're responsible for the task, the challenge, the project, the team. The minute you step into leadership, it's usually you were invited to do that right after you were good at something that was not leading. You're good at preaching. You're good with 3 points in a poem. And so they make you a pastor, as if those have anything to do with each other most of the time. You're good at running a Sunday school, and they put you in charge, not just teaching, but in charge of all the volunteers. Next thing you know, you're running VBS and you're dealing with parents, and it's even worse in the academic world. You write enough papers, they make you the dean of the faculty, as if sitting in a library is the right way to prepare you for dealing with a bunch of people who all want their own way. Leaders are formed in leading, which is another way of saying you don't learn leadership by reading books or taking workshops or going to classes, says the guy who writes books, leads workshops, and teaches classes. You learn leadership in doing. You learn and become the tempered tool when facing the mountain of despair. So when we hit the resistance, the formation begins. And that formation process happens in a process that is like blacksmithing, a repetitive process, a process of heating and holding and hammering and quenching. It's a process of heating through leading and reflection, of holding through personal and professional relationships, through hammering through spiritual practices and the practice of leadership, and quenching through rest and the slow release of leadership responsibilities. Heating, holding, hammering, quenching. Let me just say a couple of these things for you today. The first thing to recognize is the first part of heating, of making a tempered tool, a strong, flexible tool, is that it starts in a most unexpected place. Strength is found in vulnerability. In the same way, the strength of a steel begins by melting it down. This is what we don't expect. You're going to take steel that is hard and you got to make it soft so that you can make it stronger and more flexible. The heat is not just the heat of leadership, it's the heat of self-reflection. My father used to always quote to me, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen, quoting Harry Truman. And what he meant is leadership's hard. And sometimes you feel like you're under heat, and it's true. But what I want to say to leaders, and this is not necessarily good news, is the kitchen ain't hot enough. You actually need to go even deeper into the fire. That deep depth is what I would call vulnerable self-reflection. It's when you go into the fire deeper through reflecting on your experiences as a leader. John Dewey is credited with saying, you don't learn by experiences, you learn by reflecting on experiences. And one of the habits that we must cultivate to be leaders is the ability of not just experiencing something that is hard, but actually letting ourselves go even deeper into the fire of self-reflection until we feel vulnerable in the middle of it. Let me give an example from the class. When we were sitting in the class, they told us to put the steel into the fire. And about 5 minutes in, they were giving us a safety lecture while the steel was getting hotter. About 5 minutes in, they said to us, okay, here's what we want you to do. Pull the steel out. Just pull it out and look at it. Notice that it is the same color and the same consistency as it was before. It looks the same. It's 700 degrees. It will burn the skin off your hands. Don't touch it. But at 700 degrees, you can't make this into anything. It's just dangerous. At 700 degrees, it can't receive the shaping of the hammer. It's not ready to be shaped. It's just hot and dangerous. You got to put it back into the fire. You got to get it to 2000 degrees. And that, I believe, is what self-reflection does in the life of the leader. It turns up the heat. where we now begin to ask ourselves deeper questions about our own resistance to God's shaping in our lives. We find ourselves need to find places where we can be vulnerable, acknowledge our anxiety. We find ourselves praying prayers like, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there's any hurtful way in me. Because when we get anxious, we will hurt people. If we get anxious, we will hurt people. It's like being 700-degree leaders. 700-degree leaders are like 700-degree steel. They've been around some heat enough that they think they have enough. Oh, I have lots of experience. I've been through a lot of things. I've had to be with people in difficult circumstances. Don't worry, I'm fine. Notice, I'm the same color, the same consistency. It didn't affect me. What makes me such a great leader is that this heat doesn't bother me. I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm fine, we say, until we burn someone or until we break. It's brittle. We must create the capacity to be more vulnerable, to heat up to 2,000 degrees. At 2,000 degrees, that steel becomes molten. It's oozy. It can actually take the shaping. In Dr. King's life, he tells about the story of what it was like to be in the middle of the Montgomery bus boycott. He was 26 years old during the Montgomery bus boycott. It lasted over a year. For a year, he had to convince people to keep boycotting the buses that were segregated. For a year, people had to walk to work or catch a ride or carpool with each other, just for a year. And whenever people would begin to get resistant and cranky and lose hope, he would find himself doubting his own capacity. And one night, he talks about being up all night, praying before the Lord and saying, if I could get out of this without being considered a coward, I would give it up now. But he said, God met him in that moment and said to him, Martin Luther, I will be with you in all these days. I'll be with you all the time. I'm always with you. And he'd experienced over and over again God's presence right up to the time in Memphis, Tennessee, when he looked at a group of people and said, I've seen the promised land and I may not get there with you. And the next day, an assassin's bullet took him. It starts in heating, vulnerable self-reflection. I rarely say this, but I want you to know that I think if your anxiety, your fear, your tendency to want the familiar, your the human part of you that wants to return and wants to be secure keeps you from being able to be deeply self-reflective to the place of feeling as if you are vulnerable, then I think you'll never be able to become a tempered, resilient leader. I don't say these kind of things very lightly. I just know this experience. I worked with a mega church pastor who, when I was working with him on a plan that they were trying to develop in their church to create a succession plan, when I said that one of the things they had to develop was the capacity for people to try things and fail, because everybody perceived that the pastor was perfect, that he was so charismatic, so dynamic, so successful that nobody could follow in his footsteps. I said, unless you can create the capacity where people can learn, where they can literally acknowledge their failures and fail, you'll never be able to find someone who can step in here and lead this church. And that as soon as I was done, the pastor stood up and said, I'm just not comfortable us talking about failure. I don't believe God takes us through failure. I don't think we even need to talk about failure. And 2 days later, fired me as their consultant. You don't learn by experiences. You learn by reflecting on experiences. You learn by reflecting on experiences up to 2,000 degrees, where you're able to be honest, vulnerable, open to the shaping, to the leading, to the ways in which you need to grow, to the correction, to the change. When we give up our defensiveness and begin to grow, we are actually in the heat of the fire at 2,000 degrees. Heating, reflection. Now, when I was sitting in the class, the instructor said to me, okay, so here's what we want you to do. Now it's been in there long enough. Look in there. You can see that it's no longer gray. It's now kind of red and molten. Notice, reach in with the tongs, pull it out, and put it on the anvil. Don't wait. When you pull it out, notice that this steel now is like bending because of gravity. It's so malleable. It's so molten. It's gravity is making it bull. It's not hot anymore. It's not whole. It's not hard anymore. It's hot. It's molten hot, but it's not hard anymore. It's almost liquid. Put it on the anvil. Don't carry it around the room. Don't try to twist it into a shape. Do not hit it with a hammer. It'll explode. Put it on the anvil. The only safe place for something this hot is on an anvil. And that's exactly what the center of the whole shaping experience, the anvil. One of the things we learn is that the vulnerability of leadership requires relational security. Or to say it another way, the vulnerability of leadership requires the security of relationships. And if there's anything that we need to have learned afresh during this time of pandemic, is the power of relationships. Leaders need more relationships than other people. The more resistance you have in your life, the more relationships you need. And here's the great danger. All the literature tells us that the higher up you get in an organization, the less amount of of relationships you have. That the older you get, the less relationships you have. And if you're a man, it's even worse. Being male means you have less relationships. We need to think of our relationships like an anvil, like a thick, heavy anvil, an anvil that can hold us in our vulnerability. So let me have you think about your own relationships. Let me give you a little grid to think it through, and then we'll pull this together with a couple of concluding thoughts. The anvil that you need to be able to hold you when you are vulnerable, when God is shaping you, when God is creating within you the capacity to become a tool that can hew hope from despair. The anvil you need must be made up of partners, mentors, and friends, all three. Partners, mentors, and friends. Here's the way I think about it. My partners are the people who care more about the mission than they care about me. My partners are people who care more about the mission than they care about me. If they're really good partners, I know they care a lot about me. I care about them. They care about me. We develop good connection. We have great affection, great relationships. But their calling as a partner is to care more about the mission than they care about me. This is what I believe is actually the call of an elder working with a pastor, or the call of a pastor working with other leaders, or the call of people who work on teams together. We're called to be partners first and foremost. What it means is that if I stopped doing this, you'd keep going, right? If I was called to do something else, if I stopped doing it for family reasons, if God asked me to do something else, you'd keep going. That's why I know you're a partner. Partners care more about the mission than they care about me. My friends are people who care more about me than they care about the mission. My friends are the people who, first and foremost, are on Team Todd. They're my friends. They care about me. They might be people who I have relationship with. They could be people in my congregation. They might be people that I share ministry with, but I need to know the difference between my partners and my friends. My friends are the people they're the folks who say stuff like, Todd, congratulations that you got a new book out. And I go, I know. Would you like to read it? And they go, no. Not really. Like I'm really not into all that leadership stuff, but I care about you. You're my friend. You worked hard on that. I learned this actually from a member of my church when I was at San Clemente Presbyterian. There was a guy in my church who we became friends. He's about 12 years older than I am. He was raising teenagers when I had kids who were little and they're in grade school. His kids were getting married when my kids were teenagers. His kids now are having grandkids, and my kids are taking their sweet time. He became this dear, trusted advisor and friend. And we would spend a lot of time together. We'd ski together and hike together. And we had this exercise walk on a ridge trail we do together. And we would talk, and I would ask him for advice about all kinds of things. And one day I said to him, hey, I'd like you to consider being on session. And he said, thanks, you've asked me before. And I said, I know, but this year I'd really like you to consider it. I'd like you to pray about it. I pulled out the pastor card. I really think that God might want you to serve in this particular way. And I'd like you to pray about it. And finally, he looked at me and goes, look, you don't understand. I love our church, but I love you more. And if push comes to shove, I'd choose you over the church every time. And that's really dysfunctional for the church. It's really bad. You need leaders who are partners, not friends. The big mistake that is dysfunction is when leaders want their friends to be their partners or their partners to be their friends. When we start talking about the fact that as a church, this is what's so complicated. We are the family of God, but we are a family that has a purpose, a mission, why it makes it so complicated to be in our role, which is why we need people who are session members who care more about the mission than they care about me. And I need people in my life who care more about me than they care about the mission. But what we also need is mentors. And mentors are people in my life who care about me so I can be faithful to the mission that God has given me in my life. They care about me, but they care about me from even more than me. This is where I put the context of spiritual directors and therapists and other mentors. They're here for a purpose in my life. They care deeply about me, but they want me to thrive because they know that my life reverberates into other lives. This is the critical center of the anvil, is the partners and mentors and friends. So let me just say that this entire company that my wife and I have was named after a man who literally lived at the center of an anvil. He and his wife, Al and Enid Sloan, who were leaders in our presbytery, who were on the search committee that brought me to San Clemente, became the people who mentored us and loved us and cared for us. I've mentioned them in every book I've ever read, that I've written. They literally, when Al was called to be on the nominating committee that eventually would call me to be the pastor, he said to Enid, "We don't know who the new pastor will be. But if I'm on the nominating committee, I believe that God has called us to serve that pastor and that pastor's family so that they will always be able to flourish here. We have no idea who they are." When I got called there as the pastor, Al took me to lunch and said to me, "Enid and I committed that whoever would be our new pastor, we would be committed to making sure you flourished here. We want you to have a great ministry and a great life." I don't know about you, but I can barely say that without choking up. What leaders need to be able to lead well are people like this at the center of their lives, mentors who care about them deeply so that they might be able to flourish because their leadership is even more than their own lives. I always say that if I was a bishop, and I can say this to you guys as Presbyterians, but when my Methodist friends just roll their eyes at me, my Episcopal friends just crack up, which tells you more about me than you want to know. But I have bishop fantasies. And I often think if I was a bishop, I'd want to say this: if I was a bishop and I was the spiritual overseer for a group of leaders, I'd want you to know that if you ever tried to lead anything without having a therapist, a spiritual director, or a coach or a mentor, I'm going to consider that leadership malpractice. I believe every leader needs a mentor for life. You need people in your life all the time because it's dangerous to lead alone. It's like being a person who preaches without the scriptures. I didn't make this up, by the way. My wife, who is an executive coach and was a marriage and family therapist, was on our presbytery's clergy sexual misconduct task force. And when she heard one more story after another about some pastor with bad boundaries who ends up convincing a church member that they should fall in love, that they should have an illicit affair, and she picked up the pieces of these destroyed people, these people whose lives and faith were wrecked because of the bad boundaries of a pastor. She looked at me one day and came home and said, "I don't understand this. I'm a therapist. I have 15 clients. The state of California expects me to have supervision. Todd, you got 1,500 members and nobody ever asks you anything." We need anvils of relationships. The most important thing is not having the perfect mentor. The most important thing is being a mentee. It's showing up oozy, being vulnerable, having places in your life that can help you to be able to move forward, to hold on to these things. Let me just have you spend a moment. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to reflect. I'm going to pull the slides down. I want you to spend a moment just thinking for a second about this. What do you need to be more reflective? What do you need to be able to embrace more vulnerability, not less? Can you believe that God wants to meet you in those vulnerable moments? And then what do you need to be able to be more well held? What are the relationships that you need to add to your life? How's your anvil? Do you have partners? Do you have mentors? Do you have friends? I believe that resilience is not found, it's formed. And it's formed in the crucible of leadership when we are able to acknowledge that we need to be shaped, in the middle, facing the mountain of despair, and that we need to do so that we're not alone, that we can do so with heeding and holding. In the book, I go on to talk about hammering, the spiritual practices you need, and quenching, a rhythm of leading and not leading. But what I found over and over again is that for most of us, what we most need when we think we need to get stronger is we actually need to be more vulnerable and safer. We need heeding and we need holding. I want to end with a final story, but I promised you that I would give you a chance to be able to get these slides and such. So let me just put this up here on the screen for you. Here's a way that you can easily get the slides both from today and from yesterday. You can just use a QR code, or you can snap a picture of this page and you can do the checks change for later. But anything that will help you to be able to receive these slides, I'll make sure that you can get them through this way. And these presentations will be available to you. Let me finish with one final story while this is up here. Whenever we talk about blacksmithing, you talk about a process, and there is indeed a process. But one of the most important parts about blacksmithing is that there's also something about the raw material. What's the steel? What's the raw material? What's the thing that we most need? And here's one of the things that I learned when I read all about all the leadership literature, and I read all of the spiritual formation literature. When you pull these two together, there's this common overlap, that the best leaders are leaders who psychologically are differentiated. They have a clear identity. They have an identity that is grounded in something other than their need to be a successful leader, to please the people they're leading. When you look at the spiritual formation literature, you get a really common thing. In spiritual formation literature, it often talks about leaders having to have an identity in Christ that is stronger even than their need to please their people. Do you see the overlap? That what a successful leader really needs is the capacity to be grounded in something other than their need for change. This grounding is really important. This grounding in being in something other than being successful is critical. And you see this grounding even in the life of Jesus. In Mark chapter 1, we read this: "At this time, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. The moment he came out of the water, he saw the sky split open and God's Spirit looking like a dove come down on him. And with the Spirit, a voice. At this time. At what time? Before he had done anything. Before he had done any miracles, before he had preached any sermons, before he cast out any demons, before he confronted any powers, before he'd done anything. Nobody even recognized him as the Messiah except for John the Baptist. No one knew who he was. Before he had done anything, he hears a voice that says to him, 'You are my son. You are my child, chosen and marked by my love, pride of my life. My friends, what I would want you to know is when you're leading change and when you're hitting resistance, when you find yourself facing sabotage of people that is normal and natural and to be expected, and is one of the most soul-sucking things. When you know that you need to become a person who goes through the formation process to become a tool, a tempered tool that can hew and transform. Remember that the most important thing is, before you have done anything, you are already loved. You're already chosen. You are already the pride of God's life. Let me end with that.